I'm a novelist by profession, and over 20 years ago I published a novel that some of you may know, and if you don't know the novel, you may know the film that was made out of it, A Clockwork Orange. It was meant to be a kind of prophecy, a vision of the future in which juvenile delinquency is cured by pretty drastic brainwashing. Writing the book in 1960, I was thinking of the world of 1970. 1970 is long gone, and it wasn't anything like my vision. Prophets never get their prophecies right. The most nightmarish of all the fictional prophecies ever written is a novel by George Orwell called 1984. In 1984, in this novel, the entire world is dominated by a tyranny in which the individual has lost all his rights. The state has become all-powerful, and it uses torture to control the human brain, pervert human memory, rewrite human history, change the past, and control the future. The book shocked a lot of people, and the various adaptations that were made of the book shocked even more. What they were seeing was the pornography of violence. What they missed was the prophecy. But we all have the uneasy feeling that it could come true. Indeed, some people think that it might have come true in the real year 1984 if the book 1984 hadn't been written. George Orwell was warning us to look after our liberties. It's all too easy to allow a tyranny to come into existence, sometimes in the name of liberty and progress. He worried about human freedom. What sort of a man was he? What sort of a life did he lead? Well, it was a short life. He was born in 1903 and died in 1950, 46 years. He was a born writer, but writing is a difficult craft, as I know all too well. And he needed more than 46 years to say all the things he had to say, and to learn to say them as well as he could. Still, he lived a pretty full life. The materials of his books sprang out of experience, not out of the readings of other men's books. He was a man of action. He was born in India. His parents belonged to the fringe of the British ruling class, the class that used to send its sons to the territories of the British Empire as army officers and colonial functionaries. The family name was not Orwell, but Blair. George Orwell began his life as Eric Blair. He was a typical product of his class and was given the kind of education suitable for the rulers of an empire. He went to Eton, greatest of all the great schools. They always maintained that it had little influence on him. I didn't work there, he said, and I learned very little. He was not the sort of man who was cut out for formal education. He was essentially the sort of man who teaches himself. He didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge when he left school. He joined the Indian Imperial Police and was sent to Burma as a police officer. He wrote a book about Burma, his first novel, the only book I know which tells you what Burma is really like. The sights, the smells, sounds, and tastes, and also what Blair, or Orwell, thought about the British Empire. Blair, or Orwell, left Burma in 1927 when he was 24, and he started to submerge himself among the oppressed. He worked in low Paris restaurants as a dishwasher. He got to know real poverty. He went back to England and became a tramp. Yes, he touched rock bottom. He always used to say there was a certain satisfaction in touching rock bottom. It was a kind of achievement. You couldn't get any lower. Orwell was very English. He loved England. Its flowers, trees, pubs, steak and kidney pie, strong tea the color of mahogany. In 1936, after a number of odd jobs, teaching, working in a bookshop, trying to write all the time, of course, Orwell was commissioned to do some research on conditions in industrial England during the time of the Great Depression. The book that came out of these researches is called The Road to Wigan Pier. It's written with great spirit, but the facts it presents are horrific and the atmosphere is unbearably oppressive. Orwell used to dress as I'm dressed now, in corduroys. It was a kind of proletarian fancy dress. For his sympathies were passionately with the working class, but he didn't belong to it. He couldn't belong to it. He would have given anything to be able to speak like a working man, dropping his H's, but he always spoke like a member of the ruling class. He could sympathize, but he couldn't identify. The only thing he could do for the oppressed was to write about them brilliantly and to fight for them. He fought for them, literally, in 1936, when the Spanish Civil War began. He was a married man now with married responsibilities. The war broke out just after his marriage to Eileen O'Shaughnessy, a fine girl who shared his ideas and ideals and permitted him to risk his life defending the Spanish Republic against the fascist or Falangist rebels. It came as a great shock to Orwell that the Republican movement was as bitterly divided against itself as it was opposed to the fascists. He realized that the communists, far from fighting for the working class, were fighting to establish themselves as the ruling party. He was severely wounded in the throat by a fascist bullet and with difficulty escaped to Paris. He nursed his wound and his profound disillusionment. In 1938, he published Homage to Catalonia. This was a loving tribute to a region of Spain, with its capital, Barcelona, which has always cherished freedom and independence. Even now it wants to be independent of the centralizing rule of Madrid. It's also a loving tribute to the decent, ordinary men he fought with. In 1939, the war broke out for which the Spanish Civil War had been a kind of rehearsal. Orwell's fighting days were done. He joined the Home Guard, worked for the BBC and broadcast talks to India, became literary editor of the left-wing journal Tribune. He was a fine journalist. He hated fascism, but he also hated communism. He was very conservative in many ways, but he called himself a socialist. Towards the end of the war, he wrote a little fable called Animal Farm. Nobody wanted to publish it because it was obviously an attack on Soviet Russia. And Soviet Russia was Britain's ally in the struggle against Nazi Germany. Needless to say, you won't find a copy of Animal Farm in Soviet Russia. A few months before the publication of Animal Farm, Orwell's wife, Eileen, died. She'd never been strong, and Orwell's health, too, was not of the best. The two of them had undernourished themselves during the time of food shortages by giving away their rations to people they thought needed them more. Orwell, the widower, went with his adopted son Richard to the island of Jura in the Hebrides. It was not a good choice. He was tubercular and he needed warmth and someone to look after him. From 1947 onwards, he was in and out of hospital. His tuberculosis got steadily worse, but he worked hard on his last book, 1984. This was published in the spring of 1949. In the September, he was sent to University College Hospital in London, and there, in a bedside ceremony, he was married to Sonia Brownell, one of the loveliest girls I've ever known. She was a close friend of my first wife, who is now dead. Sonia is dead. We're all dying. Orwell died in January 1950. He wasn't all that satisfied with his last book. 1984, he felt, was an unremittingly gloomy book, a sick man's nightmare. It had a mixed reception. And only now are we perhaps beginning to see what it's really about. It's not a novel about the future, but about the past. The original title was to be The Last Man in Europe, but some believe that Orwell wanted to call it 1948, after the year in which it was written. Whoever was to blame, life in 1948 was drab. London, where Orwell sets his story, was full of bomb craters and empty spaces where houses used to be. It was hard to find anywhere to live. There was a perpetual sensation of being ill-clothed, underfed, dirty. There always seemed to be a gritty east wind blowing. You could never smell a joint cooking, but the reek of cabbage was everywhere. A new language is spoken in this London, which has become the capital of Airstrip 1. It's called Newspeak. The point of Newspeak is that you cannot make a statement in it which expresses criticism of the ruling party. You just don't have the vocabulary to express subversive thoughts. Even if you say Big Brother is double plus ungood, you're making an error of logic, and so you never make it. For by definition, to say Big Brother is bad is like saying that black is white. On the other hand, the party can say black is white if it wishes, and mean it too. It can also say that 2 + 2 = 5 and expect you to believe it. To know what O'Brien is about, we must use the technique of doublethink, by which a thing can be both true and untrue at the same time. We take a thing to be true when we're told it's true, and false when we're told it's false. In 1984, everything is capable of this double interpretation. There's no absolute reality. The only real things are what the party says are real. We can't control reality and say that it all exists in the party mind. We can't decide when there'll be an earthquake or when Etna or Vesuvius will erupt. We can't invent crops if there's a crop failure. Of course, the party can pretend that it wanted certain things to happen over which it had no control, but this could hardly run to an earthquake which destroyed London or a disastrous harvest. If things go wrong, it's best to have an enemy to blame. As there's always a war going on in 1984, there's no trouble about finding an enemy. And there must always be a war in order to unite the country in hatred, maintain discipline, justify shortages. The enemy doesn't matter, but there has to be an enemy. What has evidently happened in Orwell's nightmare is that the physical conditions of a real 1948 have had imposed upon them the political conditions of a totalitarian state. The population of Airstrip 1 is made up of members of the party and members of the proletariat. Ordinary working men are contemptuously known as the proles, and they make up 85% of the total. The remaining 15% consists of the outer party and the inner party. The inner party is the virtual brain of government. Here is Big Brother. The outer party, of which Winston Smith is a member, consists of the functionaries of the state, civil servants, engineers, teachers. It is they whom Big Brother is always watching. The 85%, the working class or proles, are left alone. One of the state's mottos is, only proles and animals are free. Nobody is watching the workers in Orwell's Nightmare Society. The workers can do what they like. They can shout down with Big Brother and assault members of the thought police, and nobody will care. It looks here as if Orwell has despaired of the working man. In Animal Farm, the workers are presented as horses, sheep, pigs, hens. In 1984, they've become undifferentiated animals with the freedom of animals. There's no hope for them. They will never revolt, never try to change society. They have no political sense, no patriotism, no ambition. Those that can read get pornography from the state printing machine, prole feed it's called. They all enter the state lottery and never think that the big prizes may not exist, that the whole thing is a cynical sham. They're lower than animals, they're nothing. And yet Orwell's whole life was devoted to fighting for the oppressed and dispossessed. At the end of his life, depressed, underfed, afflicted with tuberculosis, had he decided that the poor, the unemployed, the cheated were no longer worthy of his loving attention? All over the free West, ordinary citizens have learned to distrust politicians, which is a good thing. We can say and read what we like, and within limits do what we like. There are no thought police, and there's no Big Brother. I don't see our British future as a totalitarian one. The real dangers aren't coming from the state. They're all in the private sector. The IRA, Red Brigades, thugs and muggers. The state doesn't seem to have much power either to limit unemployment or put down violence. What we have to fear is our own ignorance, sloppiness in the use of language, unwillingness to reason, thoughtless admiration of mindlessness, which drugs help to promote, and of violence, which can be glossed as youthful energy. What we have to fear is the emergence from beneath, not from above, of some new energetic organization which will say, Britain is a great country, kill the blacks and the Jews, replace this weak government with a strong one, let's smarten ourselves up and wear a uniform. For it will be Big Brother shouting these words. But having read 1984, he'll be too cunning to call himself Big Brother.